Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on the podcast, Lauren Colenso Semple. She's back on for the second time. Like I said, if you want to look at that episode, it was episode 369. We talked about machines versus free weights, functional training, and hypertrophy differences between men and women. And also, real quick, if you aren't familiar with Lauren, she is currently pursuing a PhD in integrative physiology at McMaster University, and her research focuses on the impact of exercise, nutrition, and hormones on skeletal muscle. And she has worked with hundreds of clients in person and online as well. So not only doing the research, but also working with people. So that's great. I love combining both of those. Lauren, thank you for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, like I said, your episode did really well the last time, and definitely people wanted to get you back on. So appreciate you taking time to get back on here. So we last chatted in November. It's currently February, so it hasn't been too long, but is there anything on your end that has been going on? Anything, yeah, interesting from a training, nutrition perspective or anything like that?
Yeah, the most exciting thing is wrapping up my research finally. I'll be finishing the PhD in the next couple months, which is I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's very time consuming. So with that, what are the plans when you wrap up that PhD? Is there anything like in particular that you're looking to maybe add in to fill that time or yeah, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I'm interested in continuing to be involved in research. My particular interest is the sex differences and in kind of female specific physiology when it comes to exercise. And there's a lot more work to be done in that area. So I look forward to continuing to contribute to the field while also kind of keeping a hand in the practical, more translatable side of things where we can apply the research findings in our everyday life and in our exercise programs.
Awesome. So do you still want to kind of stay up to date with the research and still do more research around female physiology and stuff like that? With you completing your PhD, does that allow for more time to do more research? Does it allow more time for you to expand on like maybe the topics or yeah, what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so typically a PhD involves one or a couple of different studies on a specific topic. And so you are spending the majority of your time doing the actual study design and then data collection and then the data analysis. So for what we do, both parts are pretty time consuming because once you collect the muscle from the muscle biopsies and all of the blood work, and we also take saliva samples, we do exercise training. And so there's a lot to analyze after the fact. Although I finished collecting my data about a year ago, I've then spent this past year doing all of that analysis in the lab. And so now the final part here is doing all the writing, and that's very time consuming. And it's very focused work. And essentially, the purpose of the PhD is really supposed to make you an expert in conducting research and doing all of those different areas of research. And it's really challenging because you have to be good at, in my case, doing things like human subject data collection and doing muscle biopsies, taking blood, that's a skill in and of itself. And then doing all of the wet lab analyses, those are skills in and of themselves. Doing statistical analysis, writing. So there's a lot of skills that you need to work on and learn throughout the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know. Very time consuming. And so, yeah, I'm sure you're really happy to finish that and free up some of your time there from that standpoint. So, as far as actual like research papers go, I know you said that you just wrapped up what you were doing there. Can you mind just maybe talking about what it is? I don't think you can really talk about the findings or anything like that, but can you talk about what you were looking at and people can have something to look forward to from that standpoint?
Sure. Yeah. When I came to McMaster, I was really interested in diving deeper on, like I said, the research in women. And one of the areas that is pretty understudied is the influence of female sex hormones, hormones that fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle. If you're somebody who is not on a hormonal contraceptive, or if you are, then it's a different hormonal profile because you're taking the synthetic hormones. And while we know a lot about the influence of testosterone in men, we know much less about the influence of estrogen and progesterone in women when it comes to the potential influence on the muscular response to exercise, exercise performance, if you should be making any sort of adjustments throughout the month, if you will, based on where you are in your cycle, and if those fluctuations in hormone levels would have an influence on your performance or on your adaptations to training. And so for my PhD, the primary research questions were looking at the muscular response to exercise, so measuring muscle protein synthesis in two phases of the menstrual cycle. So before ovulation, when estrogen is the highest, and progesterone is quite low, and then repeating that study within the same person in the post-ovulatory phase when both estrogen and progesterone are high, and then seeing if those different hormonal environments would affect the muscle protein synthesis response to exercise training. And then I repeated that study design essentially in hormonal contraceptive users. And typically, if you're on an oral contraceptive pill, you would have an active hormone pill for 21 days. Sometimes it's 24. And then for the remaining 7 days or 5 days, whatever it is, you'd have a placebo pill or an inactive hormone phase. So I repeated the design under the hormonal environment where you're taking the active pills, and then in the same people collected the measurements again when they were in their kind of placebo pill or inactive pill week.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like you looked at this from a standpoint of, okay, different phases of the menstrual cycle. Did that impact anyone's ability to build muscle? I think you said you looked at muscle protein synthesis specifically. And then you also looked at people that were on the contraceptive as well, too, to see if there was any difference there with that. So that's pretty cool to be able to find out both of those. And when I think you said that should probably be published, I think you said the kind of like April, May-ish timeframe, I think you said around there.
Yeah, so I should have that data coming out soon, but I've also written a review paper that was published last year that really dove into this topic of the influence of hormones on potential outcomes. And it's a kind of complicated area of research because, like I said, we do need more research in the area, but if you're going to attribute something to a particular hormone environment, you need to make sure that you're actually measuring those hormones and not making assumptions. And so, one of my biggest takeaways from doing all of this research and measuring all of these hormones in different people at different time points is how variable it is. And while we could describe the average hormonal fluctuations throughout a given cycle, those don't necessarily look the same when we are actually comparing real hormone levels in real people. And so we need to be cautious about making assumptions and certainly making recommendations based on those assumptions because there's just a lot of guesswork that's coming into play there.
Yeah. And so I think one thing I heard from that too was like within the menstrual cycle, like there's going to be these variabilities from person to person in terms of what time of the cycle the hormones are going to alter as well too, right? Because I think the kind of misconception or common myth is that it's 28 days and that's how it is for every single person. But that's going to differ between people. Is that kind of what you were getting at there with that, like within that?
Yeah, absolutely. So your listeners might have seen programs that are advertised to train this way from day 1 to 7, or this way from day 14 to 21, or something like that. There are a variety of programs that kind of market this phase syncing or phase based training, and again, that is often based on the assumption that everyone has a 28-day cycle and then everyone ovulates on day 14, so right in the middle there. And so then you'd have 2 weeks of what we'd call the follicular phase and then 2 weeks of what we call the luteal phase. And the hormonal profile is going to be different in one phase versus the other. However, the actual length of the full cycle can vary a lot. There are people who have cycles as short as 21 days, and there are some people who have cycles as long as 38 days. And not every cycle is the same length from cycle to cycle, even within the same person. So, certainly, when we're looking at these recommendations being made to broadly for women who are interested in training, what's actually happening is that you might think that you're in one phase and therefore you're following a particular program. But in actuality, you don't have that cycle length, or you don't have a ovulation that occurs smack in the middle of the cycle. And so it's certainly an oversimplification of what's really going on and ignores the variability between women.
How can, I guess, a couple questions off of this. One, how can you account for that? And then two, how big of a, is it, and this maybe goes into what we're going to talk about eventually here with the menstrual cycle. Does it really matter anyways to really have to pinpoint that there on that? And again, maybe it just depends on if we're doing research or if it's just on like a client. I'm sure that might change that as well too, but yeah.
Absolutely. So I think from a research perspective, it's really important that you are tracking people's cycle lengths, doing ovulation tests, taking blood so that we can measure hormones. All of that is key because, as I said, if we're going to make a conclusion that these hormones are influencing some outcome in some way, then we need the hormone data to back up that conclusion. Now, the majority of the work that's been done on this topic often doesn't do that. And so, one of the major criticisms that I made in the review paper, looking at this literature as a whole, is to say, hey, we're making certain conclusions, but we didn't actually measure hormones. We didn't actually know when ovulation occurred. And so, by not doing that, we're certainly not in a place to confidently say, oh, yeah, therefore it matters. Therefore, during one phase or another, you're more likely to perform better, or your adaptations to training are going to be more favorable. There really isn't sufficient evidence to say that. And I think the influence of hormones is a really interesting question from a scientific perspective. However, we need to be careful about extrapolating that, making these recommendations before we're really confident that it's meaningful. Because frankly, if you throughout the cycle do one type of exercise and then you're switching for the next half of the month and you're doing that every month, it's against everything that we know about sound program design. I can't think of a single scenario where you'd say, oh, yeah, it totally makes sense to lift weights for 2 weeks and then do yoga and stretch for 2 weeks and then repeat that cycle. And so, what my concern is that in the absence of sufficient evidence to really support these kinds of recommendations, we're really overcomplicating things for women. And you think, oh, it's already a challenge to find a solid program, to adhere to that program, to progress and start to work towards your goals and see some results. And so if you then throw this other wrench in of, oh, and you need to be paying attention to where you are in your cycle and changing your exercise program based on that, my concern is that it's overcomplicating the whole program for women, and that it's potentially detrimental because you're adding in just another thing to have to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, it's there. So again, to sum that up, there's no research out there, at least well done, that's going to be like, hey, you need to train this way in the specific part of your menstrual cycle right now. And I guess what is that there are claims out there on social media, wherever, that hey, you should train this way. Like again, I guess maybe a kind of a good place to go with this is, what are these common claims that you'll see made around it? Because I know there was a paper, I don't know the author, but I think it was within the last year or two. I know it made its way around social media about how, oh, hey, this is more evidence that, hey, during your follicular phase, you can really push training. In the luteal phase, you need to dial it back there with that. I don't know if you're familiar with the exact paper that I'm talking about. I know I'm not giving you any help here with this. I guess, what are some of those claims that you'll commonly see made there with that you don't think is necessarily true?
Yeah, so it's really important to remember that the scientific process is a slow one, and it often starts with us doing something in cell culture and then progressing to an animal model. And that the findings in those types of studies give us a basis for a hypothesis to do a human trial. But certainly in all areas of science, there are times when you found something promising in a cell culture or an animal model, and it just doesn't translate to humans. And so there is interesting animal work on estrogen specifically, and it shows that when you remove the ovaries from a rodent, and basically turn off all of the female sex hormones, then muscle growth is much slower, and even the ability to maintain muscle is compromised. So that shows that or indicates that in that model, the absence of these hormones is a problem. However, and so then we could say maybe there's something regenerative about estrogen, but that's where the assumption has come from. Oh, estrogen must be anabolic then. But remember, I didn't say higher estrogen causes more muscle growth. I said the absence of the hormones are compromising your ability to maintain muscle. That, when we look at a human model, there's never a scenario in menopausal woman where you're just lights out on hormones. Even when you're going through menopause, it's just gradual decline. And so certainly the idea that you're experiencing cyclical fluctuations throughout the month, you have your period and the hormones are fairly low when you're on your period, and then they increase, and so you might have a couple of days where estrogen is higher, and then for the next few days then it starts to decline, and then we have a few days where progesterone is higher. And so these are short windows where the hormones are higher and lower, but that's not the same as this on off switch. However, it sets up an interesting question, because if we're seeing, oh, maybe at an extreme level, the absence of these hormones are problematic for muscle mass maintenance, then would there be a difference under a different hormonal environment? And if not, perhaps this becomes more of a menopause question, where we'd say, oh, then when we're starting to see steady and prolonged decline in hormone levels, that might contribute to the loss of muscle mass in older age. And I think that's a very interesting question that I hope to see more work on. But it's just really important to point out the difference between the model in an animal, where we can do these really extreme kind of on off switches, and then the translatability to humans, and make the distinction between pre and post menopause.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense there. So I guess from a training perspective, based on kind of the research you've done around this topic, what would be some kind of practical applications on the training side of things? I do want to dive into nutrition a little bit, but just from a training perspective, what would be your takeaways here with this, and what would you tell people that are like thinking that they need to base their training around their menstrual cycle?
Again, so because the animal model started this narrative that estrogen is somehow anabolic, we do see people arguing that, oh, because your estrogen is higher during this phase, therefore you're more primed to respond to muscle growth stimulus. But that narrative has then extended to, if estrogen is good, then progesterone must be bad. And then progesterone is somehow catabolic. And so therefore we need to back off on volume, or in some cases, I've seen recommendations that you shouldn't be doing any resistance training at all. And I would say this is a very extreme, inappropriate interpretation of the literature at this point, because frankly, if you're taking that and therefore cutting your training volume in half, that's certainly going to be more deleterious to your adaptations than if you just train throughout the month. So even if it were true, and there really isn't evidence to suggest that it is, but even if it were true that your adaptations were slightly better during one phase or another, is the argument then that the other phase is so catabolic that you're better off just not lifting weights? Like that, I struggle to see the logic.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Now that you're because like, what I got out of that is okay. So now if it's, hey, you shouldn't train during this period of time, now you're not training, like that's probably an issue, right? Where now you're not lifting, and that's going to cause some potential muscle loss and issues there with that. What about, so let's say somebody does experience, maybe during certain phases, they do experience certain symptoms of, maybe they're a little bit more lethargic, stuff like that. Is there anything that you would recommend there? Or is it just, hey, base this off of your subjective feelings and just auto regulate your training around that aspect?
I would make the same recommendation as if you didn't feel well or you were jet lagged or you didn't sleep well the night before. So there are plenty of women who experience menstrual symptoms. It's usually a day or two before you get your period, or maybe the first few couple of days of the cycle. And so I think in that sense, you should certainly feel free to adjust a training session as needed if you are experiencing symptoms and physical activity isn't helpful, or maybe you'd be feel better going for a walk that day and not testing your 1 rep max. I think that's completely reasonable. But again, we're probably talking about just adjusting 1 or 2 training sessions. We're not saying, oh, yeah, let's make these huge overhauls in your training that are going to affect literally 50% of the training that you do. And I would also, just to give it a point of comparison, if you think when you go into the gym and you're like, I didn't really sleep as well last night. Maybe I haven't had all my meals that I usually would prior to a kick-ass training session. But you don't say, oh, therefore, I'm just better off not going. You go and you push through. And not every workout is amazing, but it's about the consistency over time that's important. And even if you're not going to be able to optimize everything around every single training session, the showing up and being consistent and making that progress and setting up that routine is one of the most important pieces of this.
Right. Yeah. Keeping that momentum going there with that is super important. So again, if somebody tries to sell you, hey, we're doing some menstrual cycle phase training, again, it's not going to be backed by science, even if they say so. So be careful with that. But
They're ripping you off.
I'm sure
Don't
too,
waste your money.
I'm sure too, like, and I think probably another issue that I see with this kind of getting out is now almost to go back to your kind of point there, for some people, it gets to the point of, oh, it's because of this. And it takes the onus away from the person on, okay, what is your kind of lifestyle look like right now? Is your sleep off? Could you improve your stress management side of things? Or maybe your training is just, you're just doing too much training and like maybe you need to dial the intensity or the volume around that. And I feel this kind of thought process could take away from that. It could take away from people trying to look into what they're actually doing and just be like, oh, it's because of my menstrual cycle. That's another thing that I could see happen with this kind of thought process.
Yeah, and there is a big push to promote this idea that women need to do things really differently, when what we know is that the principles of a resistance training program apply to everybody, regardless of sex, regardless of age. We want to be doing a sufficient volume, and there's different ways to increase volume. You can fit frequency in there, but there is certainly some variables that we know are probably not as important, things like rest periods. And but point being that there isn't a secret here. The principles of a sound training program are fairly straightforward, and they apply just as much to women as they do to men. And so one of my issues with this is, again, you're targeting women and saying, oh no, hold on, you need to a different approach. You need a whole different prescription for training just because of your biological sex. And there really isn't evidence to support that.
Yeah, no, I love that. Again, you don't need to drastically change things because of that. And again, this kind of reminds me too of the concept of deloading as well too, right? Like where people are like, what is that kind of optimal time for it? It's, I think your best kind of way to go about this is auto-regulate it, see, and then again, if you have to make any adjustments from a training perspective or lifestyle perspective, look into those versus like, hey, you need to do this every 4 weeks or whatever the set amount of time is there for that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that one size isn't going to fit all. And that's, of course, the value of having a coach and having somebody who can work with you, or if you're coaching yourself and just tracking your own progress over time and seeing what works for you and what you respond better to. And because from my coaching experience, I have had clients who they can squat 3 times a week, no problem. And I would personally be completely destroyed if I did that. And but those are things that you learn and that you can experiment with over time as you optimize things for you as an individual.
Yep. So again, rather than looking at it as a sex difference, just individualize it to the actual person and how they respond. And that's going to be your best bet there. So what about like the nutrition side of things? Is there, I don't know how much if this was part of your research paper or not, if it was mostly just around training. And I don't know, do you have any knowledge around that? Is there any kind of evidence suggesting that you should alter your nutrition, how you go about that or anything like that for the menstrual cycle?
I've seen some nutritional recommendations that I think come from the same place of deciding that estrogen is anabolic and therefore making an assumption that progesterone is catabolic and therefore making the recommendation that you need to eat more dietary protein when progesterone is high, so during the latter half of the cycle. And it's so many assumptions to get there. I really don't think we're there yet in terms of needing to adjust, especially because the way that a diet is going to support adaptations to training is over time. So a single day or even a couple of days isn't meaningful in the long term. We want to see consistent, sufficient protein intake in the long term to help facilitate the adaptations to your training. And same thing with a surplus or a deficit. These adaptations take time, and the nutrition support that will help you reach the goals, whether it's gaining muscle or losing body fat or increasing performance or whatever it is, we a few days of something here and there are just not going to make or break. It's much more about the long-term plan and the consistency over time.
Yeah, no, I love that. Again, don't necessarily look at those like short term potential changes that could be going on. You got to look at the long term. So again, something like protein, it's okay, what you do over the month, over the 28 days is more important than divvying up between the certain phases of the menstrual cycle. Cool. I guess, was there anything else that you found interesting or anything that we didn't go over doing this research on this topic or anything like that?
I think we've pretty much covered it. I just will
Yeah.
say I've seen that this bleed over into areas that are not even related to exercise that will say, oh, during the first few days of your cycle, that's when you should be doing really focused creative work. And then during the next 2 weeks, like you should avoid doing any writing and I'm like, who has a job that they can? So it does get a little bit laughable.
That's crazy. So now periodizing your work and how you go about that as well too is becoming a thing now.
Yeah. So if you have to adjust not only your exercise training, but also your nutrition plan and then your work tasks, good luck,
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah, that's insane. Like you said, I don't know who could actually do that. What about moving forward? I know you said you have your paper coming out. Is there anything else that maybe you would like to see in this kind of this area of research, or is there anything that you know of coming out besides your paper or anything like that?
Yeah, I know that there are a couple different lab groups who are starting to try to join forces so we can get larger data sets, which is important. This research is really difficult to do. It's really time consuming because if you are trying to be as thorough as possible, you can't include somebody who has an inconsistent cycle, and you can't include people who are on different types of hormonal contraceptives. And you need to make sure that you're able to measure ovulation and it's consistent. So there's just so many things that go into this. And I've been absolutely humbled by having to do this research myself. It's easy to sit back and say, hey, we need more research here. But it's another thing to really understand the challenges that come with doing this work. So it's great that there's more interest in it, and not only from a skeletal muscle and resistance training standpoint, but in other areas of exercise performance. And it's something that female athletes are really interested in as well, in terms of the effects of acute exercise performance. But I'm personally most interested in the menopause question and the kind of perimenopause population, because what I wonder is at what point the hormones are having an impact, and if so, how, and then what can we do to try to proactively combat that? And I think in the absence of evidence coming out, starting to train as soon as you can, as young as you can, is a powerful way to prevent the loss of muscle mass. But we really do see it consistently with both sexes that there's this expected decline in muscle mass and muscle quality as you age.
Right. Unfortunately. So I guess a kind of follow up on that, like you mentioned, one of the issues with the research is in order to get really high quality kind of research on it, you do need to be very thorough with it. And then you have to track person by person there with that. So that can be a big issue if somebody doesn't want to be that thorough with it, which like you said, I'm sure that's very time consuming and very challenging to do. What would you recommend if somebody did want to track their cycle? Any apps? Do you have any kind of things that's backed by science that you could do here with that if you did want to track that?
I know that tracking is popular just for the kind of practical component of knowing when you're going to get your period. And there are several apps. I think none of them are necessarily better than the other. I know that the iPhone, in and of itself, like on the health app, has a tracking capability. And I think it's convenient to track if that's something that you'd like to do. It's important to know that those apps will give you a prediction of when you're ovulating, which is really more important for fertility purposes than anything else. But if you are somebody who cares about your ovulation timing, understand that the apps are using a prediction based on your average cycle length. And so, in order to really know when ovulation is occurring, you need to do a urine or a blood test. And so, the simplest is urine, and you can buy these tests at the store. But again, I'm not saying that we need to be doing this for our training, just something to be aware of if you're somebody who's using these apps and looking at it from more of a fertility angle.
Right. Yeah. I think the big takeaway from this too is that, like you said, you don't have to do this if you don't want to from a training perspective. Right now, obviously, you start talking about fertility and stuff like that's obviously a different kind of conversation there with that. Cool. I think we summed that up pretty well. Again, I think the big thing is you just don't need to periodize your training around the menstrual cycle. There's no research around that right now that says you need to do that or that it is going to impact that. Appreciate you sharing all of that. I guess the next topic I want to dive into with you is the topic of low energy availability. I know you wrote an article in Mass, I think a couple months ago on this topic specifically. And so maybe we could just start out by what is it? And then, yeah, we can go from there with the conversation.
Low energy availability describes the relationship between your energy intake and your exercise energy expenditure relative to fat-free mass. And so when you're in a state of low energy availability, we're usually seeing these in athletes who are really training hard and expending a lot of energy through exercise and then potentially under fueling. And so we're not getting a decent balance there. And the health effects for low energy availability vary from increased risk of stress fractures, the downregulated muscle protein synthesis, problems with immune function, issues with endocrine function, menstrual cycle disruption. So we really run the gamut here of this is not good for your health. And the research shows that even short terms, like 5 days or so of the low energy availability can start to show some really problematic health issues.
With low energy availability, just so people can understand, this isn't just necessarily like you're eating you're not in an energy deficit, right? It's also taking into consideration your current like body composition as well too, right? You said fat-free mass. So is it based off of like how lean you are as well too? Is that kind of a good way to look at it?
Yes. So we're looking at your energy intake and then your energy expenditure specifically from exercise. And then all of that relative to fat-free mass. That's the equation that is used to determine the low energy availability, which it comes out to be a calories per kilogram fat-free mass. And it's not the same as just being in an energy deficit. I'm definitely not saying being in a deficit. Although if you're in a really severe deficit long term, then of course there might be some health issues associated with that. But it's more of a function of you're under fueling all of this exercise performance. And one of the problems with the equation and even determining a threshold for low energy availability is that the equation doesn't take into account your non-exercise activity. And we know that varies a lot between people. And therefore, we might see people who are exhibiting symptoms that we would associate with low energy availability. But when you actually plug it into the calculation, they might not meet that threshold. But that could be due to the fact that they have a higher level of just non-exercise activity, and that's not being taken into account.
So what would be the issues? Would there be any issue with that to where it's okay, hey, they're not technically in low energy availability? And again, this is, I'm assuming, based on the equation that they have for it. But the fact that they're displaying the symptoms is probably the bigger issue at play here, right? Or probably the symptoms of that, if that makes sense what I'm trying to ask there.
Yeah, I think it's important to, just from a clinical perspective, keep everything in mind. So symptoms, doing blood work if you can, because there's obviously some red flags there. For women, the menstrual cycle dysfunction or losing your cycle completely is a huge red flag, because if you're somebody who had a normal cycle and you no longer have it, then we know there are downstream effects to various physiological symptoms from not having a cycle for an extended period of time. So that's a great red flag. And I think focusing on the symptoms is probably more productive and helpful to the patient or the athlete than focusing on the actual number.
Yeah, so really pay attention to the biofeedback aspects of it, because that's going to be most important versus like, hey, I'm at 31, so I'm good to go. That's going to be more important. A couple things you mentioned, you talked about like the menstrual cycle side of things. Again, to go back to this, that is a good sign. I don't know if this is something new here, but a lot of times it's people will talk about this and be like, oh, hey, I'm not really worried about fertility and I'm not really worried about my menstrual cycle, but could you maybe hit on that kind of myth there of as to why that's probably not great for your overall health if that is low, or maybe I'm wrong in that thought process.
Yeah, it's just a sign that you're not in an optimal state, because for reproductive function to start to go awry or start to shut down, then okay, my body isn't in a healthy state for pregnancy. And maybe that doesn't matter on at face value if you're not somebody who's interested in getting pregnant. But the point that I think you're trying to make, and I certainly would agree with, is it's a signal that things aren't going at a good rate. And then if we have the hormone disruptions, if we have the downstream effects of the risk of loss of bone density and loss of muscle, and some cardiovascular effects as well, metabolic effects of which can be long lasting, then we're seeing it affect so many other symptoms, so many other systems. And the point about losing your cycle is just that it's something you can know, like it's a tangible sign that things are not in the best state that they could be. And we see this happen when physique athletes get really lean, prepping for competition. We see it happen with endurance athletes, gymnasts, typically people who are doing a lot of physical activity and are at low body fat. That is when you're starting to run into these problems. And hopefully, when you start to come out of that and recover from that, if you will, then one of the first things we look at as being a sign of recovery and restoration is the return of your cycle. But in some cases, and depending on the sport or the particular scenario, there isn't that recovery period. And we're not entirely sure what it looks like and what are the best practices for that recovery, because often if you're talking about a competitive athlete, then they have to go into another competition season or prep or training. And so there's this balance between realizing you're making some sacrifices for your health here and understanding that they want to prioritize their competitive pursuits.
So what you're saying there is there's no matter what someone does, if they're going to continue whatever sport they're doing, or their high energy expenditure from exercise, it's you could try to eat more and more food, but it's that high energy expenditure is going to be something that's always going to get in the way. So it's for some people, depending on what their pursuits are, it might just be kind of part of what's going on. But obviously you do want to try to fix that, but it may just be with being an athlete in general. I feel like maybe it's not necessarily the healthiest thing in the world in certain aspects from that standpoint. I think that's what you were saying there with that, is that
For sure. And I think there are certain things that we can do to try to minimize the negative effects. And so one would be like try to get yourself out of that state as soon as you can. Try not to stay there for too long. So something like a physique competitor not doing these back-to-back shows, like just do a show or two and then take a true off season, increase your levels of body fat, get your cycle back, increase your food intake, maybe decrease the amount of cardio you were doing. That would be an example where you do have some control. But of course, there are other athletic pursuits where your season is really long and your training requires a huge amount of energy expenditure, and or being really low weight or low body fat is a competitive advantage. And so that's the trifecta where it's the nature of the sport, and you don't have really control over your ability to adjust these things, and you have an incentive to stay at a really low body fat.
Yeah. And kind of like you said there with a physique athlete, for example, like a lot of people will try to maintain a certain level of leanness all year round. And you can see where that will start to add up. And you almost have to gain some body fat to get back to normal there. And I know a lot of people that they don't do that and they end up hurting themselves long term because they're not willing to gain a little bit more body fat and get out of that low energy state there with that. So you mentioned some health issues. Can we maybe dive into those just in a little bit more detail? Some things that you'll see. We talked about the menstrual cycle. I know there was a few other ones that you said there. If we can maybe just hit on those in a little bit more detail.
One of the major risks is lower bone density, so decreasing bone density. And that's an issue for women in general, even regardless of when you're in a state of low energy availability. But being in this state exacerbates that. And so it makes you more susceptible to sprains or fractures if you were to fall. And even a small stress fracture just from the repetitive stress, runners will experience this. And so it's not a kind of an acute injury, but you're in a state of low energy availability and you're doing a lot of repetitive stress and your bone mineral density is starting to decline. So you're more susceptible to this. And if you do end up getting a stress fracture, the only way to heal that is rest. And often, if you're an athlete in a sport that requires impact and you need to, then you're going to take a long time to really recover because you're not able to stay off the foot and heal the injury. So that would be one example. And the other just on immune function in general. So you're getting chronically ill, just a cold, a fever, and you're unable to shake it because your immune system's not functioning properly. And so you're much more likely to get sick and you're likely to stay sick for longer.
What about, so those are big ones. I think the bone density is a big one, and then immune function is a big one. What about from a gut health digestion standpoint? Is there anything that you like will typically see from that, from being in a low energy availability state or anything like that?
I haven't really taken a deep dive into that area of the literature, but certainly if you go from a place of really low food intake and limiting your food choices, and then you try to come back from that, you can certainly have a lot of GI distress and even kind of food sensitivities that develop that you didn't have before. Because if you cut out dairy, for example, then you're sending a message to your body, oh, we don't need to make those enzymes anymore to be able to process that. And then 6 months later, you try to reintroduce it and you're like, oh, I feel sick. I must be lactose intolerant. And you're probably not, but you needed, when you're being that restrictive with your food, it can certainly have acute effects and also long-term effects if you try to reintroduce things. So that would be one of the things to keep in mind.
Yeah. And then from like a muscle building standpoint, how is this going to impact that as well?
The study that I reviewed for MASS was more of an acute trial. So they're looking at over a period of 10 days, but they did observe a substantial decline in muscle protein synthesis in response to exercise, despite the fact that they were still consuming sufficient dietary protein. So there was some older research that the argument was made, okay, clearly, if if you are in a state of low energy availability, then it's going to downregulate the muscle protein synthesis response. However, could we rescue that or could we attenuate that by upping protein intake? And with the publication of this new research, it looks like no, or at least not enough. And we know that the dietary protein is important, but it's not going to fix everything. Just the same way when you see somebody who's dieting down into a level of leanness, that eventually you're going to see hormone disruption and you're going to see signs and symptoms that are associated with being that level of leanness that you can't avoid with a dietary adjustment. Like it's just about you're not getting enough, you're not fueled enough, and this is not somewhere where your body wants to be. And So I think it's similar in the sense of if we are trying to fix these problems, we need to focus on what's the core issue here, which is the low energy availability. And you can't put a protein band-aid over it and expect that to help.
In that study too, I'm assuming they did like weight training and stuff like that too. I didn't hear you say, okay, so they were
Yes,
resistance
they
training.
did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly when you're in a deficit, even, no, it's important to continue to lift weights in order to maintain muscle mass, even if you're in such a deficit that you're probably not setting yourself up for muscle growth. So certainly the consistent weightlifting is important, consistent dietary protein is important, but at some point, you will start to lose muscle regardless of doing all of those things, just because understand that the building muscle is a a physiological process that the body is not going to prioritize if it's in a state of emergency otherwise. So when something has to give, at some point it will be muscle.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, that's not a great place to build muscle. And then, like you said, if this goes on for a long enough period of time, you could eventually lose muscle as well in this kind of state, depending on how long. I'm assuming I guess the time aspect's super important there as well too with that.
I imagine it would be, but the other thing we don't really know is for people who are coming in and out of this state over and over again, what the long-term effects are of that, because I would have to assume they aren't great. But with somebody who is in the state of low energy availability for, let's say, 3 months, and then they recover, but then go back into it and rinse and repeat, then if you're never really sufficiently recovered, then you would have to imagine that some of these effects are going to compound. And we see this with the physique world too. Like it can take some people almost a year to fully restore their resting metabolic rate, their hormones related to leptin, ghrelin, and menstrual cycle in some cases as well. And so the recovery is a slow process. Even if you might feel fine, your physiology needs to catch up.
Right. Yeah. Like you said, even if you feel fine doing your blood work as well, that could take a little bit longer for that to catch up. So you hit on this a little bit. So obviously there's the health issues. Again, like looking at your blood work, that can be helpful from that standpoint. I don't know if there's anything you want to hit on there that you would like focus on specifically, but what would be, we talked about the menstrual cycle as being like a symptom to look out for. Is there any other symptoms that you like that is a well-known kind of symptom to look out for here to see if you do have this? Yeah.
I think your body composition for sure, your exercise training volume, how recovered you're feeling. And then if there are any other kind of psychological symptoms or if your sleep is disrupted and you're getting chronic injuries, like just small injuries, it's you feel like, oh, I pulled this or I tweaked that and it keeps happening. Something isn't right. And that might mean that your program needs some adjustment. It might mean that you need to up your recovery game. But those kinds of signs are something to look out for and think, oh, we probably need to change something here. And looking at your nutrition, looking at your exercise program. And it's always important to look at the whole person.
Yeah, look at the whole thing. It's probably not just one thing, it's probably a combination. And saying that, what do you typically see or what do you think, or maybe you can theorize on this, as being a bigger issue? Is it usually the amount of exercise, or is it usually like the how much food somebody is bringing in, or is it hard to say there with that?
It's really both sides of the same coin, because if you are doing a really high amount of exercise training, but you're also fueling properly, then your energy levels are probably not going to feel as compromised. And although you certainly might be at risk for injury, you're not going to be at the same kind of risk for injury as if you were really underfueling that level of exercise activity. And so I think they go hand in hand, because even if you're somebody who's really dialed in on the nutrition aspects, it will ultimately be one and the same with, are you I don't like to use the word overtraining, but in these kinds of contexts, like they arguably are. And it's really just a matter of trying to minimize the deleterious effects of a combination of a training program that is probably too much and a diet that is probably insufficient.
Not enough, yeah. What about like the individual response side of things? I'm assuming probably for some people they're able to handle this a little bit better. And again, this is where that specific number probably isn't the greatest way to go about it because this is going to come back to the symptoms. But I'm sure there are some individual responses to this as well too, where some people are just their body's better at being in a lower energy availability state than some other people there with that. And do we see any sex differences here?
This is more of a concern for women because the nature of some of these sports are there's just more women in them. And I think the other issue that we're seeing is there's a lot of female athletes that don't prioritize resistance training, like, in addition to their sport. And so I think going in there that makes the you're starting out at a lower level of muscle mass. And so if you don't do any resistance training, then you're probably going to lose that faster. And so that's one of the areas of athletes in general, but particularly I think female athletes that should be a priority regardless of the sport. And certainly there will be inter-individual responses when it comes to what it takes to get you there. But there will be a point where the equation is what it is, and you're going to have these health consequences. So it does that vary? Does that threshold vary between people? For sure. But I don't think anyone can expect to put themselves in this kind of position and just get out scot-free.
Yeah, at some point it's going to catch up to pretty much everybody, no matter what. However, it may just be slightly different from person to person there. Last couple of things on this. Again, like we said, looking at symptoms is going to be super helpful, but then obviously looking at like blood work, is that like another kind of thing that you recommend people do to make sure that they're out of this state, or is that something that you don't think is as important?
I think for these athletes, they typically have access to team doctors where you would be able to get these blood panels. And so in that case, then yes, it's helpful. Having as much information as you can is helpful if it's affordable and accessible. And so I wouldn't want to send the message out there to your recreational exerciser that you need to be worrying about doing regular blood work, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. But typically, even when we talk about general health, when you're going in and you're describing some sort of symptoms and something feels a little bit off, then you might do some blood work in order to see if there's a marker that would align with some of these complaints that you're having. And so I think it's pretty similar in that your symptom isn't a diagnosis, and neither is blood work. Like, these all are just pieces of a puzzle that can point to a particular set of issues. And then given the circumstances and the timeline and the competition season or whatever control or lack thereof that athlete has over their training and nutrition, then hopefully we can try to make some adjustments accordingly, or at the very least try to get them out of that state and recovered as expeditiously as possible at the end of the season.
Awesome. Is there anything that we missed on this topic or anything else that you would like to share or anything like that?
I don't think so. I think we've covered it.
Cool. Awesome. I know I want to go over one quick topic here real quick before I let you go. So I wanted to talk to you around some things to focus on when building muscle for women. And one of them was just like the energy state that they're in. Do you think this something that, again, there doesn't need to be sex difference on in terms of what's kind of the optimal state? Or do you find that with women in particular, maybe you can get away with a maintenance kind of style dieting, or again, maybe even for some people, smaller surplus just based on like body composition? I'm just curious to hear how you set this up for women if they are looking to maximize muscle growth.
Yeah, I think we don't really see a lot of sex differences. Like, the kind of physiology here is pretty similar when we're looking at what is fueling muscle growth. I think practically we see more women trying to undereat and not fueling their training as much as they could be. But from a pure physiological perspective, maintenance certainly works. And especially in the beginning, you can experience a body recomposition where you're gaining muscle and losing fat in a state of maintenance or even in a slight deficit in the beginning. But as you get more advanced, then you're going to need to fuel the growth with probably some type of small surplus. And it doesn't have to be huge. I think that what we've realized is that a small surplus is all it takes, because otherwise you end up just gaining a lot of body fat that you then feel like you want to lose. And when you're losing body fat, you're also going to lose some lean mass. And we want to avoid getting into these big swinging phases of cutting, bulking, where you're gaining and losing huge amounts of weight. It's not great for your health as well as not ideal for your body composition. But I often will leave it up to the client. But I think as a coach, the biggest struggle that I run into with coaching female clients is wanting to grow muscle or improve a certain muscle group, or wanting to see more muscle in a certain area, and simultaneously wanting to be leaner, because you really can't prioritize muscle growth and fat loss at the same time. They require different approach, and if you're prioritizing one, then the other is going to inevitably take a bit of a back seat. And to the extent that the client is comfortable, then I will say we need to pick one right now to focus on. And otherwise, we're going to be in a state where you're spinning your wheels and you're not really accomplishing either goal. So I prefer to focus on one, prioritize one, and then try to set up the program accordingly so that we can see some results either way. And then you can switch gears and prioritize the other.
Yeah. And so with that, my kind of like thought on that too is because women generally just they need to have more essential body fat levels. Was it maybe less of a priority for them to get to that surplus earlier? Like you said, again, if they want to maximize it and they really do want to maximize muscle growth, it's like, hey, at some point you do have to get into that surplus there with that. But I'm just wondering, if somebody does come in with maybe not a ton of muscle and they still have some room, do they necessarily need to get into that kind of surplus initially there? Is that something that you take into consideration with that?
Not at all. And frankly, when somebody starts lifting, I think it can be easier to focus on making progress in the gym and not even worry about your nutrition. That can come later. And basically, when you're a beginner, you're going to see results. You're going to progress, even on a subpar program. So if you can be someone who starts out with a solid program, and of course, if you're eating enough, then you're going to see good results. And you can always down the road decide to take a look at the nutrition or decide to take a look at certain program variables. But I'm a big fan of keeping it simple.
Hey, that's the way to go, right? We can overcomplicate everything, and that doesn't help at all. Keeping it simple is super key. Awesome, Lauren. Before I let you go, so obviously you have your study coming out here in the next couple months. Is there any that you are interested in outside of that's coming out in the next couple months that you're keeping your eye on there with that? Or has there been any in the last couple months that have really excited you from a body comp, muscle growth perspective?
I'm excited for some more work to come out in the nutrition space. We're learning a lot more about the potential effects of these weight loss drugs, things like Ozempic is probably you might have heard. And they think that's a really exciting area for the obesity research, because for one of the first times you actually can combine a drug therapy with the lifestyle changes and with the exercise and nutrition. And so I think that will be a really interesting landscape to watch, because we know that obesity is such a problem, especially in North America. So I'm looking forward to learning more with that. One concern with those weight loss drugs is that while they're powerful, that people are losing lean mass because you're losing weight rapidly. And as I said, when you lose body fat, you often lose muscle as well, particularly if you're not resistance training. And many of these people are not. And I hope that we'll be able to get the messaging out there that, yes, these drugs are great, but you should be lifting weights while you're losing the body fat.
Yeah, which I feel like for a lot of people that kind of maybe lend themselves towards that, they end up thinking that, hey, I'll put on muscle later, right? And then I'll wait to weight train until I get the weight off. And as you said, that can become an issue because again, we definitely don't want people to lose any more lean body mass, especially when they're in that state. Yeah, no, I agree. That would be super cool to see all that come out. And Yeah, awesome. Appreciate your time, Lauren. We'll have to get you on here again in a couple months when your study comes out so we can dive into that a little bit more. Before I let you go, anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or anything like that?
Yep, you can find me on Instagram, Lauren CS1. Also check out the Mass Research Review, and we do YouTube live Q&As every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and those are free. So feel free to submit a question and come join us.
Yep, those are awesome. They're on YouTube and yeah, they're super helpful. So definitely would push everybody towards that. Cool, Lauren. We'll appreciate your time and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.